We've got a big show tonight. The mayor of Phoenix, Arizona is here with us live in just a few minutes. President Trump, of course, is in Phoenix, Arizona tonight, despite requests from local authorities there, including the mayor, that the president please not make this trip, that he please not do this rally, not in Phoenix, not now. The mayor of Phoenix, who's about to join us in a moment, he is a Democrat, but some of the news breaking tonight about the conflict over the president's Arizona rally really is not Democratic versus Republican politics. It's very much just Republican politics. Republican politics sort of pushed to the max, to the point where the former chief of staff to the top Republican in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, his former chief of staff is tonight issuing threats to President Trump that if President Trump doesn't back off what he's doing to attack other Republicans right now, he may find himself facing impeachment in the Senate sooner rather than later. Unnamed Republican sources are also making very serious allegations to the New York Times tonight that beyond the allegations already being investigated, that the president may have pressured the FBI to drop its Russia investigation. Beyond the existing investigation into whether or not the president obstructed justice when he fired the FBI director to try to stop the Russia investigation. Unnamed Republican sources are telling the New York Times tonight that the president may also have tried to block the investigation into the Russia matter that's being conducted in the United States Senate by the investigating committees in the United States Senate. In fact, these allegations tonight from these Republican sources speaking to the New York Times are that those efforts by the president to potentially obstruct those inquiries into that part of the Russia matter, those efforts by the president may be continuing tonight as we speak. So this is actually, I think, potentially a very serious turn in the ongoing investigations into this president, into the Russia scandals that continue to swirl around this presidency. Now, in order to understand what's going on here, though, the details of this, I'm gonna lay out the story as the New York Times tells it tonight. The details of this at first are just going to sound like a politics story, but if you wade through those Beltway politics just a little bit, what you end up with very quickly looks like it may be a brand new problem for the White House in terms of potential obstruction of justice by the president, personally. All right, so here's the story. The president tonight, as you know, has gone to Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix has a Democratic mayor, who we're going to speak with in a moment, but the state also has a Republican governor and 2 Republican senators. Now, it is not an accident tonight that neither the Republican governor of Arizona nor the 2 Republican senators from Arizona are going to be attending this event with the president. That is because those 2 Republican senators from Arizona, at least, they appear to drive this president crazy. Even before Arizona Senator John McCain blocked the last Republican effort to repeal Obamacare in the Senate, the president's hatred and disdain for Senator John McCain had brought Trump close to political disaster with his attacks against McCain, even targeting McCain's heroic war record. So that's McCain. He's the senior senator from Arizona. The junior senator from Arizona is Jeff Flake, who has been more confrontational toward President Trump than almost any other elected Republican anywhere, including in a recent book where he's highly critical, not just of President Trump, but he's critical of himself and the Republican Party for allowing Trump to become the party's nominee and their president. Since then, President Trump has repeatedly gone after Senator Flake, giving him the schoolyard nickname Flake, Jeff Flake, which isn't even a good nickname as Trump nicknames go. More substantively, he has been hyping a Republican Senate primary challenger in Arizona who ran against John McCain in the last election cycle and who wants to run against Jeff Flake in the next election cycle. She lost quite badly to John McCain last year. It's hard to tell at this point whether she poses a real threat to Jeff Flake next year. But she is expected to be at this rally tonight with President Trump in Phoenix. And that comes after Trump has spent days now hyping her candidacy and talking up her chances against Jeff Flake. So that is, I know that just sounds like, you know, electoral politics, right? Just Beltway politics. That is the immediate political context, the immediate political background of what's going on in this story. Mitch McConnell, of course, is the top Republican in the Senate. Whatever you think about him as a politician, as a leader, as a Republican, Mitch McConnell definitely does take seriously his own responsibility in the Senate to help other Republican senators keep their seats. to help sitting Republican senators fight off Republican primary challengers, to win their general elections against Democratic candidates, to fend off scandals that might unseat them from their Senate seats, right? At the very least, Mitch McConnell needs to keep at least 50 other Republicans in the Senate so he gets to keep his job running the Senate. But also, regardless of that math, he just habitually goes to bat for any sitting Republican senator in order to keep them in their jobs. Well, now that this Republican president has moved on from just insulting one Republican senator in Arizona to now trying to unseat the other Republican senator in Arizona, heading into this Arizona rally tonight, we knew that Mitch McConnell was upset with the president's behavior. We knew that he was trying to undercut the impact of what the president is doing. We knew that Mitch McConnell was going to try to sort of blunt the effect of Trump's Screw Jeff Flake trip to Arizona by hosting his own Mitch McConnell high-dollar fundraiser for Jeff Flake this week. We also learned today that a PAC associated with Mitch McConnell has started running ads against that Trump-endorsed candidate who's going to run against Jeff Flake in the Republican primary next year. And I know how this sounds. If you're interested in partisan politics, if you're interested in intra-party fighting and electoral politics and the balance of power in the Senate and stuff like that, those are all interesting details, right? This is an interesting story. This is an interesting tale of intra-party fighting to follow. But you only have to follow it that far before it jumps to a place that is way beyond politics. Because tonight in the New York Times, this little politics story moved from interesting to uh-oh if you are the White House. First, there's that impeachment threat that I mentioned. A man named Billy Piper is quoted by name tonight in the New York Times. He's now a lobbyist. Until recently, he was chief of staff to Senator Mitch McConnell. And Billy Piper throws this threat in the president's direction tonight in the Times. When you hear the threat, you'll understand why it's important that he allowed himself to be quoted by name in making it. Here's what he said, quote, "The quickest way for Trump to get impeached is for him to knock off Jeff Flake and Dean Heller and be faced with a Democrat-led Senate." All right, now, in a typical political fight, that would be the place where you'd give, a little bluster, a little brushback. You don't want to lose the Senate, do you? With this president, a brushback citing basic Senate math like that very quickly becomes a fairly credible threat of impeachment for the president. And Republicans, apparently, are not afraid to say it, including Republicans very, very close to the top Republican in the Senate who controls what happens in the Senate, Mitch McConnell. So there's that, the impeachment threat. But here's the worst part from the White House's perspective. Apparently, before Trump and McConnell stopped speaking to each other altogether, which is where they're at now, apparently the last time they spoke, they had what is described in the Times tonight as a, quote, profane shouting match on the telephone. This reportedly happened on August 9th. President Trump apparently placed the call from one of his golf courses, and he spoke with Senator McConnell directly. Citing Republicans, quote, briefed on the conversation, Alexander Burns and Jonathan Martin at the New York Times tonight report that there were two subjects that Trump and McConnell screamed and swore at each other about on that call on August 9th. Number one was, who's responsible for Republicans failing to repeal Obamacare? Okay, got it. We knew they were fighting about that already. But the other subject they apparently screamed and swore at each other about was something very different. I'll just quote to you directly from the Times. Quote, "During the call, which Trump initiated on August 9th from his New Jersey golf club, the president accused Senator McConnell of bungling the health care issue. Quote, he was even more animated, though, about what he intimated was the Senate leader's refusal to protect Trump from investigations of Russian interference in the 2016 election." Again, that's according to Republicans briefed on the conversation. So in a call that is described as devolving into a profane shouting match, the president is reportedly berating and screaming at and swearing at the majority leader in the Senate because the senator hasn't protected him from the Russia investigations that are being carried out under his purview by various committees in the Senate. Now, again, this is according to multiple Republican sources who were briefed on that reported conversation between Trump and McConnell on August 9th. The reason that is potentially very, very important and not just a salacious detail about famous people yelling at each other, the reason that's potentially a big uh-oh for the White House here is because the criminal concept of obstruction of justice applies not only to law enforcement, i.e. FBI investigations, it also applies to efforts to influence, obstruct, or impede the due and proper exercise of the power of inquiry or investigation is being had by either House in Congress or by any committee of either House in Congress. And if that sounds wordy and arcane as language, it's because in reading that, I am quoting the language of the criminal statute that defines obstruction of justice and makes clear that obstruction of justice as a crime, as a criminal matter, that applies to efforts to impede or pervert or pressure investigations, not just by cops and prosecutors or the FBI. It also applies to efforts to impede or pervert or obstruct congressional investigations. Now, we're going to have some expert advice on that in just a moment, but remember how we got the special counsel investigation of this president in the first place. I mean, where the Bob Mueller special counsel investigation came from was not just allegations about Russian interference in the last election. It was not, Trump administration figures constantly being caught lying about their contacts with Russians, things they initially denied, but then later they had to admit to. None of that was enough. The reason we got the Bob Mueller special counsel investigation was because the president fired the director of the FBI. And that firing followed credible allegations that the FBI director was fired after he refused to accede to pressure from the president that the FBI should drop the Russia investigation. If the president has also been, or is also now, pressuring the leader of the Senate to drop the Russia investigations that are under his purview in the Senate, then that's not just personality-driven political gossip. That's a big deal. I mean, particularly if he has been pressuring the Senate leader to protect him from these Russia investigations, and McConnell has not been doing that to the president's satisfaction, and now in response, the president is politically punishing Mitch McConnell for not going along with his pressure. And this part of it is not like secret cloak and dagger stuff. I mean, if this August 9th phone call that is reported in the New York Times today, if this happened the way these Republican sources say it happened, if the president was berating Mitch McConnell on August 9th, berating him and swearing at him over McConnell not protecting the president from the Senate Russia investigations, if that's true, well, look what's happened since that call happened. I mean, starting August 9th, the president has been using his Twitter feed repeatedly to attack Senator Mitch McConnell by name. The day after that reported call, on August 10th, the president gave a press availability from his golf course in New Jersey, where he suggested that perhaps Senator McConnell should resign as the leader of the Republicans in the Senate. Now tonight, less than 2 weeks later, the president is in Arizona trying to inflict maximum political pain on Senate Republicans in direct political conflict with Senator Mitch McConnell. It's one thing if that's just politics. It's interesting, but it's politics. If instead this is the president politically punishing Mitch McConnell for McConnell refusing to accede to the president's Russia demands, then this will likely open a new front in the investigation of potential obstruction of justice by the president. Now, the Russia investigations that are happening in the investigative committees in the Senate, those investigations, as far as we can tell, are full steam ahead. Today, the Senate Judiciary Committee took what is reported to be many hours of testimony from the head of the political research group behind the infamous dossier of alleged Russian dirt on Donald Trump. That dossier was reportedly handed over to the FBI last year. It was published by BuzzFeed in January. It has been the source of a lot of controversy. Glenn Simpson is a former investigative journalist for the Wall Street Journal. He was reportedly interviewed by Senate Judiciary Committee staff today for 10 hours. There's one report tonight that he handed over as many as 40,000 documents to the committee. Again, Fusion GPS, his outfit, is the group that ultimately commissioned that dossier. And he just handed over 40,000 documents? The leader of that committee is Republican Senator Chuck Grassley. And we've talked about here on the show the fact that Senator Grassley in the past has made an effort to try to undermine the dossier by attacking its origins and by attacking Fusion GPS. So far, those efforts have really been to no effect. But today, ABC News reports that the man who actually created the dossier, not the guy who, commissioned it and arranged for payment for it, but the former MI6 officer in Britain who collected the intelligence, who contacted those sources, who wrote up the dossier in the first place, the man who was hired by Fusion GPS to create the dossier, Christopher Steele himself, according to ABC News today, not only has talked to the FBI in detail about the dossier and how he put it together. According to ABC News today, Christopher Steele has given the FBI specific information about the identity of his sources that he used to put the dossier together. Now, if that ABC News report is true, that would allow the FBI to retrace Christopher Steele's steps to either verify or disprove what is in that incredibly inflammatory dossier. You'll remember that the key claim of the dossier, aside from a bunch of salacious personal stuff, is that the Trump campaign not only knowingly colluded with the Russian attack on the election last year, but that it was the end product of a years-long relationship that involved the exchange of politically useful information, that included potential coercion by Russia toward Trump, and that included extensive illicit financial ties between Trump businesses, and Russian entities, including some that are close to Vladimir Putin. I mean, that's what's in the dossier, right? If the firm that paid for that investigation just handed over 40,000 pages worth of documents, and the founder of that firm just gave 10 hours of testimony, and if the intelligence agent who collected that information has confided information about his sources to the FBI for their own investigation of those matters, well, then you could see where the pressure might be boiling up from in terms of the White House really wanting to try to shut down these investigations. And looking ahead in terms of next steps, Christopher Steele himself, the former MI6 agent, he is being eagerly sought by the investigative committees in the Congress as a potential witness for their inquiries. We do not know if that will ever happen. Obviously, that would be basically a truckload of political dynamite for this country if he did testify and if his story held up. So, I mean, obviously, there were high stakes here already. If this New York Times reporting and this ABC News reporting tonight bears out, the stakes have just gotten that much higher. And I just want to put one last point on it. We just got some exclusive new national polling. We just got it in from PPP, Public Policy Polling. This is due to come out tomorrow. They've given us an exclusive first look at these numbers tonight, so you haven't heard these anywhere else. These are exclusive to us. This is national survey results, factoring in Democrats and independents and Republicans, who, of course, remain very loyal to Donald Trump. Here are these national top-line results. Quote, do you think that the Russia story is fake news or not? Answer from the American people, no. America does not think the Russia story is fake news. Question 21. Quote, do you think that members of Donald Trump's campaign team worked in association with Russia to help Trump win the election for president or not? Answer from the American public, yes. We think members of Donald Trump's campaign team worked in association with Russia to help Trump win the election for president. And here's the crucial follow-up question. Question 22. Quote, if evidence comes out that proves conclusively that members of Donald Trump's campaign team worked in association with Russia to help Trump win the election for president, do you think Trump should continue to serve as president, or do you think he should resign? Answer from the American people by a 20-point margin. Yeah, in that case, Trump should resign. So this is a clear majority of the American public in that instance. Again, this is new national polling that's coming out from Public Policy Polling tomorrow. They gave us an advanced look at some of these numbers tonight. In terms of the methodology of this polling, it was conducted through yesterday, so it doesn't include any public reaction to whatever the president's going to say tonight in Arizona. It doesn't involve reaction to this new reporting in the New York Times that the president may have another obstruction of justice line of inquiry to worry about now. This time, what's reported to be an effort by the president to shut down the congressional investigations into his campaign in Russia. Again, we're going to have expert advice on that potential new inquiry coming up. Plus, the Phoenix mayor joining us live. We got a lot to get to tonight. Stay with us. Hey
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.